My true story from Alabama. I lost my husband. Then my son said, "You'll be alone too." If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. My name is Dorothy Mae Henderson, and I'm 73 years old. I've lived in this same white clapboard house on Magnolia Street in Birmingham, Alabama, for 47 years. The walls hold memories of birthday parties with homemade chocolate cake, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the hardwood floors, and Sunday dinners that went on for hours while the gravy grew cold and the conversation grew warm. But tonight, as I sit in my grandmother's old rocking chair with a cup of sweet tea growing cold in my hands, those same walls feel like they're closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of all that's been lost. 3 months ago, I lost my husband of 51 years. Harold James Henderson wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend, my dancing partner, my steady companion through every season of life, my reason for getting up every morning, and my comfort when I laid my head down every night. We met at a church social when I was 21, fresh out of nursing school, and he was 23, working at his daddy's auto repair shop and dreaming of opening his own place someday. I remember that evening like it was yesterday, even though it was over 5 decades ago. The church fellowship hall was decorated with crepe paper streamers in pink and white, and Mrs. Caldwell had made her famous punch that was more sugar than anything else. Harold wore a navy blue suit that was slightly too big for his lean frame, probably borrowed from his older brother. And when he worked up the courage to ask me to dance, his hands were shaking so badly I thought he might drop me right there on the polished floor. "I'm not much of a dancer, Miss Dorothy," he whispered in my ear as we swayed awkwardly to "The Way You Look Tonight" playing on the old record player. "Well, good thing I am," I whispered back with more confidence than I felt, and he laughed so hard that Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife, shushed us from across the room where she was ladling punch. That was Harold, always finding joy in the simplest moments, always ready with a smile that could light up the darkest day. Even decades later, when arthritis made it hard for him to button his shirts and tie his shoes, he'd joke that it gave him an excuse to ask his beautiful wife for help. Even when his memory started slipping these past few years, forgetting where he'd put his reading glasses or what we'd had for breakfast, he'd still remember to tell me I looked beautiful every single morning, still remember to kiss my forehead before we went to sleep each night. The cancer took him quickly, too quickly, the doctor said. 6 weeks from the diagnosis that hit us like a thunderbolt to the goodbye that came too soon. The oncologist, a kind young woman with gentle eyes, said we were lucky it wasn't a long, drawn-out battle that would have left Harold suffering for months. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt cheated, robbed of the time we should have had together. 51 years wasn't enough. 100 years wouldn't have been enough. I can still see Harold in that hospital bed during his final days, his once strong hands thin and pale against the white sheets, but his eyes still holding that same sparkle that had caught my attention all those years ago at the church social. He kept apologizing for leaving me, as if dying of cancer was somehow his choice, his fault. "I'm sorry, Dorothy Mae," he whispered one afternoon when the autumn sunlight was streaming through the hospital window. "I know this isn't what we planned. We were supposed to travel more, see those grandchildren graduate, maybe take that cruise to Alaska you've been wanting." "Harold James Henderson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You stop that talk right now. We've had 51 beautiful years together. That's more than some people get in 2 lifetimes. But inside, my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. How do you say goodbye to the person who has been your whole world for more than half your life? How do you imagine tomorrow when the person who made all your tomorrows meaningful won't be there to share them?" The funeral was everything Harold would have wanted. Simple, dignified, filled with love. Our church, Mount Olive Baptist, was packed with people whose lives Harold had touched in ways both big and small. He'd fixed cars for half the congregation over the years, never charging much, always willing to take the time to explain what was wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. The pastor, Reverend Williams, spoke beautifully about Harold's generous heart, how he'd slip $20 bills to struggling families and pretend it was change he'd found in his coat pocket, how he'd show up without being asked whenever someone needed help moving furniture or fixing a leaky roof. After the service, as we stood in the church cemetery where 4 generations of Hendersons are buried, People kept saying the same things with sincere faces and gentle touches on my arm. "Call if you need anything, Dorothy. You shouldn't be alone right now. We're here for you, honey." Harold was a good man, and he wouldn't want you to struggle. My son Michael was wonderful that day, staying close to my side, making sure I ate something at the reception in the church fellowship hall, helping me thank everyone who came to pay their respects. He took charge of the practical details, arranging for the flowers to be donated to the nursing home, making sure Harold's good suit was returned to the funeral home, handling the paperwork that death seems to require in such overwhelming abundance. "Don't worry about anything, Mom," he said as he drove me home that evening. "Jennifer and I will take care of everything. You just focus on resting and taking care of yourself." But as the weeks passed after the funeral, those heartfelt promises of support seemed to evaporate like morning dew in the Alabama sun. The parade of casseroles and covered dishes that had filled my refrigerator gradually stopped coming. The phone calls from church friends and neighbors became less frequent, then sporadic, then almost non-existent. And Michael, my only child, the little boy I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful and considerate, started treating me like I was made of the finest china, fragile and likely to break at any moment, or worse, like I was becoming invisible, a burden he didn't quite know how to handle. "Mom, you really should think seriously about selling this house," he said during one of his increasingly brief visits about 6 weeks after the funeral. He was standing in my living room, hands on his hips, looking around like he was appraising the place for auction. "It's way too big for just you now, and the upkeep is getting more expensive every year. The roof needs work, the foundation has some settling issues, and that old heating system is going to give out any day now." I wanted to tell him that this house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof, windows and doors and rooms that needed cleaning. It was where I'd brought him home from the hospital as a newborn, where I'd rocked him to sleep during those long nights when he had nightmares about monsters under the bed. It was where Harold and I had slow danced in the kitchen after dinner every Friday night for decades, his work clothes still smelling like motor oil and my apron dusted with flour from whatever dessert I'd been baking. It was where we'd hosted countless family gatherings, Thanksgiving dinners with 3 kinds of pie, Easter egg hunts in the backyard, 4th of July barbecues that lasted until the fireflies came out. This was where our grandson Tyler had taken his first wobbly steps, lurching from the coffee table to Harold's waiting arms. It was where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where we'd weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. It was where Harold had breathed his last breath, holding my hand and telling me he loved me one final time. But instead of trying to explain all of that to my son, I just nodded politely and offered him more coffee from the pot I'd made when I heard his truck in the driveway. Michael's wife, Jennifer, was polite but increasingly distant during their visits. She'd sit on the edge of the sofa like she was ready to leave at any moment, making small talk about her job at the insurance office and Tyler's activities at school, but never asking how I was really doing, never mentioning Harold's name, as if speaking about him might somehow make my grief worse instead of better. Their teenage son, my grandson Tyler, barely looked up from his phone during these family visits. I understood that 15-year-olds had their own world of concerns, friends and school and sports, and all the complicated business of growing up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was becoming increasingly irrelevant in his life, just another adult he had to endure politely until he could escape back to his room and his video games. I understood they all had their own lives, their own problems and responsibilities and daily struggles. Michael's construction business was busier than ever, which should have been good news, but seemed to stress him out more than anything else. Jennifer was dealing with some kind of workplace drama involving a new supervisor who didn't appreciate her 20 years of experience. Tyler was struggling with advanced algebra and had made the junior varsity basketball team, which meant practices and games that filled up all their evenings and weekends. But despite my rational understanding of their circumstances, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that my grief had somehow made me inconvenient rather than someone who needed love and support. It was as if Harold's death had created a void in their lives that they preferred to step around rather than help me fill. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air had that crisp quality that had always made Harold want to rake them into huge piles for Tyler to jump in when he was little. Michael had stopped by to check on me, but from the moment he walked through the front door, He seemed agitated and distracted, constantly checking his watch and drumming his fingers on whatever surface was nearest. His construction crew was behind schedule on a big job, he explained, and the client was threatening to find another contractor if they didn't meet the deadline. Jennifer was dealing with her difficult boss again, and there was talk of layoffs at the insurance office that had everyone on edge. Tyler needed help with a science project that was due Friday, and there was a parent-teacher conference that evening to discuss his slipping grades in math. "I really can't stay long today, Mom," he said before he'd even sat down properly. "It's just been one thing after another lately." I was trying to tell him about how I'd been going through some of Harold's belongings, how I'd found a box of his old tools in the garage that had made me feel close to him again. The tools were still organized exactly the way Harold had left them, each screwdriver and wrench in its proper place, and touching them had brought back so many memories of watching him work, of the satisfaction he took in fixing things with his own capable hands. I mentioned that maybe Michael would want some of the tools someday, that his father had always hoped Tyler might develop an interest in working with his hands, in building and fixing things the way Harold had done all his life. "Mom, I really don't have time for this right now," Michael interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration and impatience. "Dad's gone. He's not coming back. Going through his stuff and dwelling on memories isn't going to change that fact. You need to start accepting reality and move on with your life." The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me speechless and stunned. I sat there in my own living room, watching my son pace around like a caged animal, his face flushed with an anger that seemed disproportionate to anything I'd said or done. "Look, I'm trying to help you here," he continued, his voice getting louder and more agitated. "But you're making it really difficult. Jennifer thinks maybe you should talk to someone professional, like a counselor or a therapist or something. This constant dwelling on the past, this obsession with Dad's things and memories, it's not healthy, Mom. It's not normal." "I'm not dwelling," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat tight with the tears I was trying not to shed. "I'm grieving. I'm trying to process the loss of the man I shared my life with for 51 years. "Well, you can't grieve forever," he shot back without a moment's hesitation. "The rest of us have to keep living. We have jobs and responsibilities and problems of our own. Tyler has school activities and basketball practice. Jennifer's got that promotion opportunity she's been working toward. I'm trying to keep my business afloat in a tough economy. We can't all just stop our lives and wallow in sadness because Dad died." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Michael looked shocked at his own words, as if they'd come out of someone else's mouth, but he didn't take them back or try to soften them. He just stood there, car keys all ready in his hand, ready to escape from this conversation and from me. That's when he said it, the words that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward, the words that would change everything between us. "You'll be alone too if you keep this up, Mom. People get tired of constant sadness and negativity. Even family has their limits. Even people who love you will eventually walk away if you can't move past this." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the old clock on the mantelpiece ticking, could hear a dog barking somewhere down the street, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Michael looked stricken by his own words, but instead of apologizing or trying to explain what he'd meant, he just grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and headed for the front door. "I'll call you later this week," he mumbled as he paused in the doorway. But we both knew he wouldn't, not after what had just happened between us. After he left, after I heard his truck start up and drive away, I sat in that same rocking chair where I'm sitting now, and I cried harder than I had since the day Harold died in that sterile hospital room. But this time, I wasn't just crying for my husband, for the love I'd lost and the future we'd never have together. I was crying for the son I thought I'd raised, for the family I thought would wrap around me like a warm blanket during the hardest time of my life, for the support system I'd counted on that was crumbling beneath my feet. "You'll be alone too." Those 5 words replayed in my mind like a broken record as I sat in that empty house, as I made dinner for one person and ate it in silence, as I watched the evening news by myself and tried to focus on stories about people whose problems seemed so much smaller than my own. The words followed me as I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Harold for 47 years. As I got ready for bed, in a room that still felt too big and too empty, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if my own son was right about me. Was I really so burdensome? Had my grief become such an inconvenience that it was pushing away the people I loved most? Had I been too needy, too sad, too focused on memories of Harold, instead of trying to build some kind of new life without him? Maybe Michael was right. Maybe I needed to move on, whatever that actually meant for a woman who'd lost her partner of 5 decades. But as the days passed and I replayed that awful conversation over and over in my mind, something inside me began to shift and change. The hurt and shock gradually transformed into something else. Not anger exactly, because I understood that Michael was overwhelmed and stressed, and probably didn't mean to be as cruel as he'd sounded. But it wasn't acceptance either. It was a quiet, steady determination, a resolve that surprised me with its strength. If my own son, the child I'd raised with all the love and patience I could muster, thought I was too much trouble to deal with, if my grief and my memories made me unworthy of basic compassion and understanding, then maybe it was time to stop depending on other people for my sense of worth. Maybe it was time to find my own way forward, to discover who Dorothy Mae Henderson could be when she wasn't defined entirely by her relationships to other people. I'd spent 51 years as Harold's wife, learning to see myself through his eyes, finding my identity in being the woman he loved and cherished. I'd spent 37 years as Michael's mother, pouring my energy into raising him to be a good man, measuring my success by his achievements and happiness. I'd spent 15 years as Tyler's grandmother, delighting in his accomplishments and growth, finding joy in being someone he could count on for unconditional love and homemade cookies. But who was Dorothy Mae when she wasn't Harold's wife, or Michael's mother, or Tyler's grandmother? It had been so long since I'd thought about that question that I barely knew where to start looking for the answer. The first step toward finding out came accidentally, the way important things sometimes do. I was at the Piggly Wiggly grocery store on a Thursday morning, struggling to reach a box of cereal on the top shelf, my arthritis making it painful to stretch my arms above my head, when another woman about my age appeared beside me like an angel. "Here, honey, let me help you with that," she said, easily grabbing the box of Cheerios and handing it to me with a warm smile. These stores seemed to think we all grew 6 inches taller after we turned 65. I laughed, actually laughed out loud. For the first time in weeks. It felt rusty and strange, like a muscle I'd forgotten how to use, but it also felt wonderful. Her name was Ruth Caldwell, no relation to the Mrs. Caldwell who used to make punch at church socials. And she'd lost her husband 8 months earlier to complications from diabetes. We ended up talking for 30 minutes right there in the cereal aisle, comparing notes about the challenges of adjusting to cooking for one person and sleeping alone in a bed that suddenly felt enormous. She told me about the strange things that triggered her grief, hearing her husband's favorite song on the radio, seeing his brand of coffee at the store, catching a glimpse of a man with similar posture walking down the street. "It's the little things that get you," Ruth said, as we slowly pushed our shopping carts toward the checkout area. "Everyone expects you to cry at the big moments, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. But nobody warns you about how hard it is to buy just one pork chop, or how quiet the house gets without someone else moving around in it." As we waited in line to pay for our groceries, Ruth mentioned something that would change the course of my life. "You should come to our group," she said, digging around in her purse for a business card. "It's just a bunch of us widows who meet every Thursday morning at the community center on Oak Street. Nothing fancy or formal, just coffee and conversation, and maybe some store-bought donuts. Sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, but we always understand each other in ways that other people just can't." I almost said no immediately. The thought of sitting in a circle with a bunch of strangers, talking about grief and loss and all the painful emotions I was trying so hard to manage, felt overwhelming and embarrassing. What would I say? How could I explain the complicated mix of sadness and anger and loneliness that filled my days? What if I started crying and couldn't stop? But then I remembered Michael's harsh words. "You'll be alone too." Maybe I already was alone, more alone than I'd ever admitted to myself. Maybe it was time to do something about that isolation instead of just sitting in my empty house waiting for other people to remember I existed. The following Thursday morning, I sat in my car outside the Oak Street Community Center for 10 minutes, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel, ready to put the car in reverse and drive straight home. The building looked cheerful enough, red brick with white trim and bright yellow flower boxes under the windows. But my heart was pounding like I was about to walk into a job interview or a medical appointment. Finally, just as I was about to give up and go home, Ruth tapped on my passenger window. She'd spotted my car from inside and had come outside to rescue me from my own anxiety. "Come on, Dorothy," she said with the kind of warm, encouraging smile I hadn't seen in months. "The coffee's terrible, but the company's good, and Mildred brought homemade apple fritters this morning." Inside the community center's meeting room, I found 8 other women ranging in age from 62 to 87. They welcomed me with genuine hugs and gentle questions, asking about Harold and sharing their own stories of loss. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like my grief was an inconvenience or a burden that other people had to tolerate. Margaret, a tiny woman with steel gray hair and bright blue eyes, had lost her husband to a massive heart attack 2 years ago. She was still learning to manage finances that her husband had always handled, trying to understand investments and insurance policies and tax forms that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Linda, who'd been widowed for 18 months, was struggling with anger at the unfairness of losing her husband in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. She talked about the rage that would hit her at unexpected moments, making her want to scream at innocent cashiers and helpful neighbors who had no idea what she was going through. Betty, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes, had been widowed for 5 years but still talked to her husband's photograph every morning over coffee, updating him on family news and asking his opinion about decisions large and small. "People think there's a timeline for grief," said Evelyn, the group's unofficial leader at 87. She'd been widowed twice and had the wisdom that comes from surviving multiple devastating losses. "They expect you to be over it after a few months, back to your old self, ready to move on and start dating or traveling or whatever they think you should be doing. But the truth is, you don't get over losing the love of your life. You learn to carry the loss differently, to build a life that honors what you've lost while still allowing room for whatever comes next." That evening, feeling more hopeful than I had in months, I called Michael. I wanted to tell him about the group, about how good it felt to be around people who understood what I was going through, about the relief of not having to pretend I was fine when I wasn't. But the conversation was brief and awkward. He seemed relieved that I was getting out of the house and meeting people, but he didn't ask any real questions about my experience or show genuine interest in this new development in my life. "That's great, Mom," he said in the same tone he might use to respond to news about a neighbor's garden club. "I'm glad you're finding ways to stay busy." Busy, as if grief were just a matter of having too much time on my hands. As autumn turned to winter and the Thursday morning meetings became the anchor of my week, our group, we'd started calling ourselves the Thursday Sisters, evolved into something much more meaningful than just a grief support meeting. We went to movies together, tried new restaurants, took day trips to antique shops and small-town museums. We celebrated each other's birthdays and anniversaries, creating new traditions to fill the spaces left by our losses. Ruth became my closest friend, the first real friend I'd made in years. She'd been married to her high school sweetheart for 48 years, and like me, she was learning to rediscover who she was as an individual rather than half of a couple. We started taking watercolor classes at the community college on Tuesday evenings, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was busy taking care of everyone else's needs before my own. "Look at that sunset you painted, Dorothy," Ruth said one evening as we cleaned our brushes after class. "Who knew you had such artistic talent hiding inside you all these years?" I looked at my painting, a simple landscape with rolling hills and a dramatic sunset sky in shades of orange and purple, and felt genuinely proud of something I'd created with my own hands. When had I stopped doing things just for the pure joy of doing them? When had I forgotten that I was capable of learning new skills and developing new interests? Through the Thursday Sisters, I learned about volunteer opportunities at Children's Hospital downtown. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, I started spending time in the pediatric ward, reading stories to young patients who were stuck in hospital beds, far from their own toys and familiar surroundings. Their faces would light up when I walked into their rooms with my canvas bag full of picture books, and their laughter became a kind of medicine I hadn't known I needed. One little girl named Emma was in the hospital for several weeks with a complicated bone infection that required multiple surgeries and a long course of intravenous antibiotics. She was 7 years old with curly red hair and freckles, the same age Tyler had been when he went through his dinosaur phase and wanted to be a paleontologist when he grew up. Emma loved stories about brave princesses and talking animals, and she always asked me to stay just 5 more minutes when visiting hours ended and I had to leave. She reminded me of the joy I'd found in reading to Tyler when he was small, before video games and social media and the general business of growing up had replaced our quiet moments together. "Mrs. Dorothy," Emma said one afternoon, as I finished reading a story about a mouse who dreamed of becoming a ballet dancer, "do you have grandchildren?" "I do," I told her, thinking of Tyler with his basketball practice and his struggles with algebra. "A grandson who's almost grown up now. Does he like stories like these?" I thought about Tyler, always buried in his phone during family visits, barely acknowledging my presence, seemingly uninterested in anything that didn't involve his friends or his sports or his video games. "He used to," I said honestly. "When he was little, he loved hearing about dragons and knights and magical kingdoms." "Maybe he still does," Emma said, with the kind of wisdom that sometimes comes from children who are facing difficult things. "Maybe he just forgot how to ask for them." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that evening through the Birmingham traffic. Had Tyler forgotten how to ask for things from me? Had I forgotten how to offer them? When had we stopped really talking to each other? Stopped sharing the kinds of stories and experiences that used to bring us together? Christmas was approaching. The first Christmas without Harold. And traditionally, the whole family would come to my house for a big dinner and gift exchange. Harold and I would spend days preparing, cooking his favorite ham with pineapple and brown sugar glaze, making cornbread dressing and green bean casserole and sweet potato pie. The house would be filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, with Tyler's excitement over his presents and Harold's terrible jokes that made everyone groan and laugh at the same time. But this year, Michael suggested we meet at a restaurant instead. "It'll be easier for you, Mom," he said when he called to discuss the holiday plans. "Less cooking, less cleanup, less stress, more time to just relax and enjoy being together as a family." What he really meant, I understood, was that it would be easier for them. Less time spent in my house full of memories, less obligation to linger and make meaningful conversation, less risk of encountering grief or sadness that might make everyone uncomfortable. I agreed to the restaurant plan because I didn't have the energy to argue, and because I wasn't sure I could handle hosting Christmas dinner without Harold there to carve the ham and tell his stories about Christmases past. But something inside me rebelled against the idea of spending Christmas in a sterile restaurant booth, making small talk over food that someone else had prepared. 2 weeks before Christmas, I made a decision that surprised even me. I invited the Thursday sisters to my house for Christmas Eve dinner. I hadn't cooked for a group since Harold's last birthday in March, but the thought of filling my dining room with laughter and conversation, of using my good china and lighting candles and creating something beautiful felt like coming back to life after months of just existing. "Are you sure about this, honey?" Ruth asked when I extended the invitation during our Thursday morning meeting. "That's a lot of work, and the holidays can be emotionally difficult. Harold and I used to host Christmas Eve every year," I told the group, feeling more excited about something than I had in months. "The table would be full of family and friends, and the house would smell like ham and sweet potato casserole and my grandmother's dinner rolls. I miss that feeling of abundance, of having a home full of people who want to be there." The Thursday sisters embraced the idea enthusiastically. Everyone offered to bring something to contribute to the meal, but I insisted on cooking most of it myself. I wanted to feel useful again, wanted to remember what it was like to nurture people who would appreciate the effort and the love that went into every dish. Christmas Eve arrived with a light dusting of snow, unusual for Alabama, but magical nonetheless. My house was transformed as the Thursday sisters arrived, each woman bringing not just food, but warmth and joy and the kind of energy that had been missing from my life for months. Margaret brought her famous green bean casserole and stories about her husband's terrible Christmas karaoke performances that had mortified their children but delighted everyone else. Linda contributed homemade cranberry sauce and shared memories of Christmas mornings with her 3 daughters, now scattered across the country with families of their own. Betty arrived with a bottle of wine and a photo album full of pictures from Christmases past, and as we looked through the photos together over appetizers, I realized something beautiful was happening. We weren't trying to recreate the past, or forget our losses, or pretend that everything was fine. We were creating something entirely new, a chosen family built on understanding and acceptance and mutual support. The dining room table, which had felt too big and too empty for months, was perfect for our group of 9 women. We held hands for grace, and Evelyn offered a blessing that brought tears to my eyes. We're grateful for the love we've known and the memories we carry with us. We're grateful for the new friendships that remind us we're not alone in this journey. May we honor our past while embracing whatever the future holds for us. As we shared stories and laughter over dinner, I felt Harold's presence in the room, not as a source of sadness, but as a reminder of how love continues even after loss, how the capacity for joy and connection doesn't die with the people we've lost. He would have loved seeing me surrounded by these women, would have appreciated their humor and kindness and the way they'd rallied around me during my darkest time. After dinner, we exchanged small gifts and shared our hopes for the coming year. When it was my turn to speak, I looked around the table at these women who had become so important to me in such a short time. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion I was feeling. I thought losing Harold meant losing everything that mattered, everything that gave my life meaning and purpose. But all of you have shown me that love takes many forms, that family isn't just about blood relationships. Thank you for reminding me that I still have so much to give and so much to receive. Michael called that evening to wish me Merry Christmas. I could hear Tyler and Jennifer in the background, probably getting ready for their own Christmas morning traditions, wrapping last-minute gifts and preparing for another day of obligations and expectations. "How was your day, Mom?" he asked. And for once, he seemed genuinely interested in the answer rather than just making polite conversation. I told him about the dinner, about the Thursday sisters and how they'd become such an important part of my life, about how good it felt to have a house full of laughter and stories again. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I wondered if he was really listening or if he was distracted by something else. "That sounds really nice," he said finally, and I could hear something different in his voice, maybe surprise, maybe relief, maybe even a little guilt. I'm glad you're doing better." "I'm not doing better," I corrected him gently but firmly. "I'm doing differently. I miss your father every single day and I always will. The grief hasn't gone away and it's not going to. But I'm learning that grief doesn't have to mean giving up on life or isolating myself from possibilities for connection and joy." Another long pause. Then, "Mom, about what I said that day back in October, about you being alone. I was really stressed about work, and Jennifer was having problems with her new supervisor, and Tyler was struggling in school, and I guess I took all that frustration out on you. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." It wasn't quite a full apology for the cruelty of his words, but it was acknowledgement that he'd been wrong, that he'd hurt me when I was already struggling. I accepted it as a beginning, a first step toward rebuilding the relationship that had been damaged by grief and misunderstanding. "We're all learning how to navigate this new reality," I said. "Your father's death changed everything for all of us, and we probably don't all grieve the same way or on the same timeline." On Christmas Day, I visited Emma at the hospital. Her parents had decorated her room with tiny white lights and paper snowflakes cut from construction paper, creating Christmas magic in the sterile hospital environment. I brought her a new book, a story about a grandmother who goes on adventures around the world, and we read it together while snow continued to fall outside her window. "Mrs. Dorothy," she said when we finished the story, "you seem different today. Happier, maybe?" "I think I am," I told her, touched by her perceptiveness. Sometimes happiness sneaks up on you when you're not looking for it, when you're focused on other things. The new year brought changes and opportunities I couldn't have imagined just a few months earlier. Through my volunteer work at the hospital, I met Dr. Sarah Chen, a young physician who ran a literacy program for elderly patients who had never learned to read properly or who were losing their abilities due to medical conditions or cognitive decline. "You have a real gift with people, Mrs. Henderson," she told me one afternoon, as I was finishing up my reading session with Emma. The patients always ask when you're coming back, and several of them have mentioned how much they enjoy talking with you. Would you be interested in helping with our adult literacy program? I started spending 3 mornings a week at the hospital, working one-on-one with patients who wanted to improve their reading skills or maintain abilities that were declining due to stroke or dementia. There was Frank, a 78-year-old man who dropped out of school in 3rd grade to work on his family's cotton farm and had carried the shame of his limited reading ability his entire life. There was Maria, a grandmother whose stroke had affected her language comprehension, and who was determined to regain the skills she needed to read bedtime stories to her grandchildren. Working with these adults required patience and creativity, and a willingness to celebrate small victories, but their progress was incredibly rewarding. Frank cried the day he successfully read his first complete newspaper article to me, stumbling over some of the bigger words but getting through the entire sports section story about Alabama football. Maria beamed with pride when she successfully read a simple children's book about a cat who loved to dance, her words slow but clear. These moments reminded me that I had value and purpose beyond my traditional roles as wife and mother and grandmother. I was good at teaching, good at encouraging people, good at seeing potential in others even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Spring arrived early that year, and I made another decision that would have surprised the Dorothy May of 6 months earlier. I decided to plant a garden. Harold and I had always maintained a large vegetable garden behind the house, but I hadn't touched it since he got too sick to help with the heavy work of tilling and planting. The plot had grown wild with weeds, and I'd assumed I'd never have the energy or motivation to reclaim it. But something about the lengthening days and the warmth in the air made me want to get my hands dirty again, to create something beautiful and productive from the earth. Ruth and several other Thursday sisters volunteered to help, and we spent several weekends in March preparing the soil and planning what to plant. Harold would love seeing this, I said, as we worked together to clear away the weeds and prepare neat rows for tomatoes and peppers and green beans. Tell me about his garden, Ruth said, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead with the back of her gardening glove. I found myself sharing memories I hadn't talked about in months. How Harold would wake up before dawn during the summer to water the plants before the Alabama heat got too intense. How he'd bring me bouquets of flowers he'd grown himself just because it was Tuesday. How proud he was of his prize-winning tomatoes at the county fair every September. But instead of making me sad, talking about these memories while creating something new felt healing and hopeful. I wasn't trying to recreate Harold's garden exactly as it had been, with his precise rows and his complicated system of stakes and strings. I was honoring his memory while making something that reflected who I was becoming. A woman who could tend and nurture and create beauty on her own terms. Tyler surprised me by asking to help with the garden when he visited one Saturday in April. At 15, he was all arms and legs, gangly and awkward, but enthusiastic, and we worked side by side for 3 hours without him checking his phone once. Grandpa always said you were the one with the real green thumb, he said as we planted marigolds around the border of the vegetable patch. He was being generous, I said, touched that he remembered Harold's words. But I did love working alongside him. There's something peaceful about having your hands in the dirt, watching things grow from tiny seeds into something that can feed a family. Tyler nodded thoughtfully, and for a moment he looked so much like Michael at that age that my heart caught in my throat. I've been thinking about taking shop class next year instead of another computer course, he said. Dad says it's not practical in today's economy, but I kind of want to learn how to build things like Grandpa did, work with my hands instead of just staring at screens all day. Your grandfather would have loved that, I told him, remembering Harold's workshop in the garage, the careful way he'd maintained his tools, the satisfaction he took in fixing things instead of throwing them away. He always said there was something satisfying about creating something useful with your own hands, something that would last. As summer approached, I realized I'd been thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I was discovering about myself. The Thursday Sisters had become a central part of my life, but I was also building other connections and pursuing interests I'd never had time for before. I'd joined the church committee that organized meals for new mothers and families in crisis. I'd started attending the community college's senior lecture series, learning about topics ranging from local history to astronomy. I'd even signed up for a day trip to Nashville with a group from the senior center. Michael began to notice the changes during one of his regular visits. I was showing him photos from our group's trip to a butterfly conservatory in Montgomery when he interrupted me with an observation that caught me off guard. "Mom, you seem... I don't know how to put this exactly, but you seem more like yourself lately." "What do you mean by that?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly struggling to articulate something he'd been thinking about. "When Dad first died, it was like part of you died too. Which made sense, I guess, considering how long you'd been together. But lately, you're talking about the future again, making plans, getting excited about things. You seem more present, I guess, more engaged with life." I thought about his observation as I made us sandwiches for lunch, considering whether he was right about the changes he'd noticed. Was I more present, or was I just present in a different way than he expected, a way that didn't require his constant worry and management? "Losing your father changed me fundamentally," I said, as we sat down to eat at the kitchen table, where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals over the decades. "I'll never be the same person I was when he was alive, and I don't think I should try to be. But I'm learning that doesn't mean I have to be less than I was. Maybe I can be different, but still whole, still capable of growth and joy and purpose." Michael looked uncomfortable, the way he always did when conversations turned emotional, but he didn't change the subject or check his watch or make excuses to leave early. "I'm sorry I wasn't more supportive during those first few months after Dad died," he said finally, his voice quiet and sincere. "I didn't know how to help you, and seeing you so devastated made me feel helpless and angry. I guess I thought if I could just fix the practical stuff, help you with the house and the finances and all the paperwork, then somehow you'd feel better and everything would go back to normal. Grief isn't a practical problem that can be solved with the right approach," I said gently, wanting him to understand without making him feel worse about his earlier mistakes. "It's something that has to be lived through, experienced, integrated into a new way of being. It can't be rushed or managed or fixed from the outside." He nodded slowly, though I wasn't sure he fully understood yet. That was okay. Understanding comes in its own time, often through our own experiences of loss and difficulty. In July, Emma was finally well enough to leave the hospital after months of treatment. Her parents organized a going-home party in the hospital's family lounge, and they invited me to join the celebration. I brought her a special gift, a beautiful journal with a cover decorated with butterflies where she could write her own stories about brave princesses and magical adventures. "Will you still visit me at home sometimes?" she asked as I hugged her goodbye, her small arms tight around my neck. "Of course I will," I promised. "And you can show me all the stories you write in your new journal." Watching Emma reunite with her siblings and cousins, seeing her excitement about returning to her own bedroom and her own toys, reminded me of how precious family connections are, but also how they can't be the only source of meaning and purpose in our lives. Emma would grow up, just like Tyler was growing up, just like Michael had grown up decades ago. The love would remain, but the relationships would inevitably change and evolve. That was natural and healthy, but it meant I needed to have my own foundation to stand on, my own reasons for getting up each morning. As autumn approached again, marking almost a year since Harold's death, I found myself thinking about how much had changed, not just in my circumstances, but in my understanding of myself and what I was capable of. I still missed my husband terribly. I still sometimes reached for his hand in the darkness or turned to share a thought with him before remembering he wasn't there. But the sharp, devastating edge of grief had softened into something more manageable, something that had become integrated into my daily life rather than dominating it completely. The Thursday sisters were planning a group trip to Gatlinburg for the fall foliage, and I was excited about the adventure. I'd never traveled anywhere without Harold, but the idea of exploring somewhere new with friends felt like a gift I was finally ready to give myself. I was in my garden one afternoon, harvesting the last of the summer tomatoes and preparing the beds for fall planting, when Michael called with news that truly surprised me. "Tyler wants to spend next weekend with you," he said. "Just the two of you, no parents hovering around. He's been asking a lot of questions about Dad lately, wanting to hear stories about when I was a kid, trying to understand his family history better. I think he's at that age where he's starting to think about who he is and where he comes from." My heart swelled with joy and anticipation. Of course he's welcome any time. We could work in the garden together, or I could teach him to make your father's favorite cornbread, or we could just sit on the porch and talk. He'd like that, Michael said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I think he needs some time with someone who has stories to tell and patience to listen. That weekend with Tyler became one of the most precious experiences I'd had since Harold's death. We spent hours going through boxes of old photographs and mementos I'd been avoiding for months, but this time, instead of being overwhelmed by sadness, I felt grateful for the opportunity to share Harold's story with someone who was genuinely interested in hearing it. Together, we created a scrapbook about Harold's life, not just as my husband, but as Michael's father and Tyler's grandfather, and a man who had lived a full, meaningful life before any of us even existed. We included pictures of Harold as a young man in his army uniform, photos from our wedding day when we both looked impossibly young, snapshots of him teaching Michael to drive in the empty parking lot behind the church. I wish I'd known him better when he was healthy, Tyler said as we worked, carefully arranging photos and writing captions in his neat teenage handwriting. When I was little, I just thought of him as the grandfather who always had peppermints in his pocket and let me stay up late to watch baseball. I didn't really understand that he was a whole person with his own story and dreams and disappointments. He understood that, I assured Tyler, remembering Harold's infinite patience with his grandson's childhood questions and demands. Children aren't supposed to see adults as complex people until they're ready to handle that complexity. But now you're old enough to appreciate who he really was, and that would make him very happy. We spent the entire weekend talking about Harold's life before marriage, his service in Vietnam that he rarely discussed, his work as a mechanic, and his reputation for honesty in a business where many people tried to take advantage of customers who didn't understand cars. Tyler asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to my answers, and for the first time since Harold's death, sharing memories felt celebratory rather than painful. On Sunday morning, as Tyler was getting ready to go home, he asked if he could take some of Harold's tools with him. I want to start learning to fix things and build things, he said, his voice serious and determined. Dad's always too busy to teach me, and he doesn't really have the patience for it anyway. But maybe I can figure some stuff out on my own, and when I use Grandpa's tools, it'll be like he's helping me learn. I packed a small toolbox with some of Harold's favorites, his hammer with the worn wooden handle that fit his grip perfectly, his set of screwdrivers organized by size, the level he'd used to hang every picture in our house with mathematical precision. Watching Tyler carry the toolbox to Michael's truck, I felt Harold's presence so strongly it took my breath away. That evening, after Tyler left and the house grew quiet again, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the oak trees that Harold had planted when we first moved to this house 47 years ago. The tomatoes were heavy and red on the vine, perfect for the last batch of sauce I'd make before the first frost. The marigolds glowed golden in the fading light, and the whole garden hummed with the satisfaction of a season well tended. I thought about Michael's cruel words from a year ago. You'll be alone, too. In some ways, he'd been right. I was alone in this house, alone in this life I was building without Harold's physical presence. But alone didn't mean lonely, and it certainly didn't mean worthless or invisible. I was alone like a tree is alone, rooted in one place but reaching toward the light, providing shade and beauty and sustenance to anyone who needed it. I was alone like a gardener is alone, tending and nurturing, creating something beautiful from raw earth and possibility, working with the cycles of seasons and growth. The Thursday sisters were planning another potluck dinner for the following week, and I was experimenting with a new recipe for Harold's favorite cornbread, trying to recreate the slightly sweet, crumbly texture he'd loved so much. Frank had made tremendous progress with his reading and wanted to celebrate by reading a poem to our group that his late wife had written about their honeymoon 50 years ago. The children at the hospital were always excited to see me, and I'd started bringing small craft projects for them to work on while I read, giving their hands something to do while their minds traveled to magical places. My life at 73 looked nothing like I'd expected it would when Harold and I made our plans for retirement and old age together. But it was fuller and richer than I dared hope during those dark months immediately after his death, when getting through each day felt like an overwhelming challenge. I'd learned that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms, evolves, finds new ways to express itself and connect us to the world. Harold's love had become part of who I was, woven into my character and my capacity for caring about others. But it didn't define the limits of who I could become or what I could contribute to the world. As fireflies began to blink in the gathering darkness and the air filled with the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of crickets, I smiled and raised my glass of sweet tea in a toast to the evening, to the garden, to the life I was still living and learning to love in new ways. Tomorrow was Thursday, and the sisters would be waiting at the community center with terrible coffee and wonderful conversation. Next week, Tyler would call to tell me about his progress with Harold's tools and ask for advice about his shop class project. The children at the hospital would be eager for new stories, and Frank would practice reading his poem one more time before sharing it with people who understood the significance of small victories. I was 73 years old, and I was alone, and I was exactly where I needed to be.